Chapter 24, Truman and Cold War America, 1945 to 1952. Individual choices, Jackie Robinson. In high school and college, Jackie Robinson proved he was a gifted athlete, but few would have thought those gifts would contribute to one of the most important choices in American sports. As this chapter's individual voices feature illustrates, great controversy surrounded the idea of African Americans playing baseball's white major leagues. In 1945, Branch Rickey, the president and general manager of the Brooklyn Dodgers, asked Robinson if he was the right man to play baseball in the Dodgers' system to integrate Major League Baseball. Rickey wanted to know whether Robinson could take abuse, be someone with guts enough not to fight back. Robinson said he could turn the other cheek and the deal was set. Robinson would get $600 a month to play with the Montreal Royals, a Dodgers farm team. At Muir Technical High School, Pasadena Junior College, and the University of California at Los Angeles, Robinson excelled in athletics, lettering in 4 sports: track, baseball, football, and basketball. In 1941, he was drafted into the Army and applied to Officer Training Corps, which was accepting applications from African Americans for the first time. He completed training in 1943, received a commission as second lieutenant, and was assigned to a segregated tank regiment. Remember, the World War II is happening right now. Robinson never deployed to Europe or saw combat. Involved in an alleged racial incident and charges of insubordination resulted in a court-martial that kept him stateside. Acquitted, Robinson was honorably discharged from the Army in November of 1944. He played professional baseball with the Kansas City Monarchs of the Negro Leagues until he went to Montreal in 1945. With Montreal, Robinson quickly experienced the racial hostility that Rickey had predicted. The club held spring training in Florida where he could not room at the team hotel, and some local officials canceled games rather than let him play on their field. Robinson survived, and during the regular season led the Royals as minor league in batting and was 1946's most valuable player. The following year, he would play in the majors for the Dodgers. On April 15, 1947, Robinson became the first African-American player in Major League Baseball since the 1890s. He immediately faced racial tensions within the clubhouse and on the field. Team manager Leo Durocher made his views clear. "I do not care if the guy is yellow or black or if he has stripes like a zebra, I say he plays. What's more, I say he can make us all rich. And if any of you cannot use the money, I will see that you all are traded." When players threatened to strike rather than play against Robinson, the commissioner of baseball vowed to suspend them. These actions kept Robinson in the games, but did not stop the verbal and physical abuse that he received on and off the field. Robinson responded with his bat, fielding, and base running, earning the Rookie of the Year title. The integration of Major League Baseball was history. Robinson played 10 seasons with the Dodgers before retiring, and he entered the Baseball Hall of Fame in 1962. When World War II ended, Americans expected to return to a normal life, living in peace while they enjoyed the benefits of a consumer society. Many found jobs that allowed them to move to the suburbs and to live the American dream. But world peace proved more elusive. By 1947, the US and the Soviet Union were locked in a Cold War. It really started in 1945. Washington's policy was to contain Soviet power, first in Western Europe and then in Asia. That's containment. When North Korea invaded South Korea, the Cold War suddenly became hot as President Truman committed American troops to halt communist aggression, domino theory, and all that good stuff. The Cold War affected every aspect of American life. The growing fear of communism provided many with ammunition to attack ideas, institutions, and people they believed were too liberal, like in the Second Red Scare. Conservatives and business people asserted that unions had become too powerful. They needed to be restrained and purged of their communist members. Southern whites charged that civil rights advocates were tainted with socialist values, and we're going to see the Dixiecrats emerge with that. Across the nation, change and diversity were increasingly suspect. Spearheading America's defense against the dangers of communism were the House Un-American Activities Committee HUAC and Republican Senator Joseph McCarthy. Both claimed that American institutions were rife with disloyal Americans. The expanding Cold War also made it more difficult for Truman to introduce or expand on New Deal-style programs. Truman had to accept the politics of the possible, a moderate agenda that pleased neither ardent liberals nor staunch conservatives. Despite growing concerns about communism, the majority of Americans looked forward to transitioning to a normal life. The GI Bill provided veterans a means to re-enter civilian life with new opportunities. Those who had found new opportunities during the war, however, were expected to relinquish their wartime gains and return to their customary roles in American society. Looking at you, ladies. Still, a sense of optimism prevailed. The skills, experiences, and self-confidence gained during the war could not be taken away from anybody. Women, people of color, they've experienced something different. They've gone through this sort of radical change within themselves, and now they want more out of America and more out of life, and they're willing to fight for it. The Cold War begins. Considering the 3 questions: what views and actions chosen by the Soviet Union and the US contributed to the Cold War? How was the containment policy applied to Western Europe between 1947 and 1951? And how did the Truman administration promote and protect American interests in Latin America and the Middle East? Around the globe, people hoped an enduring peace would follow the defeat of the Axis powers, but could the cooperative relationship with the Allies continue into the post-war era without a common enemy to unite them? In World War II, the enemy of my enemy was my friend. We worked with the Soviet Union not because we liked them, but because we had to, because they hated the Nazis too. Suspicion and distrust already existed over the Soviet creation of a zone of security with friendly governments in Eastern Europe, looking at the Iron Curtain a little bit, and President Harry S. Truman appeared less willing than Roosevelt to trust the Soviets. The Soviet Union needs us more than we need them, Truman told a colleague. Although he was new to formulating foreign and domestic policy, Truman was determined to face the challenges. The buck stops here, read a plaque in his office. Truman and paths to peace. Truman and other American leaders identified two overlapping paths to peace: international cooperation and deterrence based on military strength. In 1944, as a means to achieve global cooperation and economic development, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank were created. At the Dunbar Oaks Conference, delegates from the US, China, Britain, and the Soviet Union mapped the basic structure of the United Nations, the UN. In April of 1945, a conference in San Francisco finished the task. It wrote the Charter of the United Nations, an organization of 6 distinct bodies, the most important of which are the General Assembly and the Security Council. Composed of all member nations, the General Assembly was the weaker body with authority only to discuss issues, whereas resolving issues was the responsibility of the Security Council, composed of 11 nations. 6 nations were elected by the General Assembly, but the real power was held by 5 permanent members: the US, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, China, and France. To give the UN authority, the Security Council could apply economic and military pressures against other nations, but to protect their interests, each of the 5 permanent nations could veto Security Council decisions. So all of those 5 have veto power. When it was decided to house the headquarters of the UN in New York City, Truman noted that the center of Western civilization had shifted from Europe to the United States. Still, most Americans did not want to rely solely on international cooperation to maintain national security or peace. They concluded that the US must continue to field a strong military force with bases around the globe, maintain its atomic monopoly, meaning we're the only ones with the atom bomb. That would be true only until 1949, and take the lead in creating the conditions for an enduring peace. Drawing on lessons learned during World War II, most Americans believed in halting aggressors, supporting democratic governments, and promoting a prosperous world economy. From this perspective, the Soviet Union appeared to be threatening world peace by following an ominous course in Eastern Europe, creating undemocratic puppet governments, and closing the region to free trade. As 1946 began, Truman concluded that he was tired of babying the Soviets, and the State Department asked its Russia expert, George Kennan, to evaluate Soviet policy to determine its motivations and goals. Kennan's long telegram described the Soviet totalitarianism as internally weak. Soviet leaders, he said, held communist ideology secondary to remaining in power and needed Western capitalism as an enemy to justify their rule. But, he argued, Soviet leaders were not fanatics and would retreat when met with opposition. He recommended a policy of containment, meeting head-on any attempted expansion of Soviet power. His report immediately drew high praise from Washington's official circles. Soon thereafter, Truman adopted a policy designed to set will against will, force against force, idea against idea, until Soviet expansion is finally worn down. By the spring of 1946, increasingly fearful of Soviet intentions, both Democrats and Republicans tried to educate the public about the Soviet threat to world stability. One of the most dramatic warnings, however, came from Winston Churchill on March 5, 1946 at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri. Why is he touring the United States? Because he has been, he's been replaced. Churchill is no longer Prime Minister of Britain. With President Truman sitting beside him, the former Prime Minister of Britain decried Soviet expansionism and stated that an iron curtain had fallen across Europe. Churchill called for a fraternal association of the English-speaking peoples to halt the Russians. Truman thought it was a wonderfully eloquent speech, but it would do nothing but good. Churchill, Time magazine pronounced, had spoken with the voice of a lion. The Iron Curtain, by the way, was the name given to the military, political, and ideological barrier established between the Soviet bloc and Western Europe after World War II. As Churchill spoke, a crisis loomed in Iran. During World War II, the Big Three had stationed troops in Iran to ensure the safety of Lend-Lease materials going to the Soviet Union. The troops were to be withdrawn by March of 1946, but as that date neared, Soviet troops remained in northern Iran. When the deadline passed and reports flashed that the Soviets were advancing rather than withdrawing, some worried that war was imminent. After Britain and the US sent harshly worded telegrams to Moscow and petitioned the UN to consider an Iranian complaint against the Soviet Union, Soviet forces soon evacuated Iran. The crisis was over, but it convinced many Americans that the war with the Soviets was possible. Red fascism had replaced Nazi fascism, and for the sake of civilization, there could be no more appeasement. The division of Europe. As the crisis in Iran receded, events in Europe assumed priority. A deepening economic crisis across Europe appeared to favor leftist parties, and their assertion that state controls and state planning led to quicker economic recovery. Basically, the economy's in the tank, and it appears that people on the left are having solutions, and that's going to worry us because anything to the left is going to be tainted red. It's going to maybe be a little bit too much communist flavored for American liking at this point in time. But the most immediate trouble spots were in Greece and Turkey. The Soviets were pressuring Turkey to permit them some control over the Dardanelles, the straits linking the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. In Greece, a civil war raged between communist-backed rebels and the British-supported conservative government. In February 1947, Britain informed Washington that it was unable to provide economic or military aid to the two nations and asked the US to assume its role in the region to prevent communist expansion. Truman eagerly assumed the responsibility of world leadership with all of its burdens and all of its glory. And of course, what becomes known as the Truman Doctrine, you can remember it because Truman loves greasy Turkey, its support for Greece and Turkey, and it turns out other nations too. To convince Congress and gain public support for the $400 million to support Greece and Turkey, Truman overstated the crisis, presenting an image of the world under attack from the forces of evil. On March 12, 1947, he set forth the Truman Doctrine, offering an ideological black and white view of world politics. He said that it was the duty of the US to support free people who resisted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressure. Congress agreed and provided aid for Greece and Turkey. Bolstered by American support, Turkey resisted Soviet pressure and retained control over the straits, and the Greek government was able to defeat the communist rebels in 1949. Although the Truman administration asked Congress only to support Greece and Turkey, officials admitted among themselves that their request was just the beginning. It happens that we're having a little trouble with Greece and Turkey at the present time, stated a War Department official, but they are just one of the keys on the keyboard of this world piano. On June 5, 1947, Secretary of State George Marshall uncovered more of the keyboard. He offered Europe a program of economic aid to restore stability and prosperity, the Marshall Plan. For the Truman administration, the difficult question was whether to include the Soviets and Eastern Europeans in the invitation. To do so would seem contrary to the intent of the Truman Doctrine. But if the Soviets were excluded, the US might be seen as dividing Europe, an image the State Department wanted to avoid. Chaired by Kennan, Mr. Long Telegram, the State Department planning staff recommended that the US take a hell of a big gamble and offer economic aid to all Europeans. Kennan believed the Soviets would reject the offer because it involved economic and political cooperation with capitalists. Thus, Marshall invited all Europeans to work together and to write a program designed to place Europe on its feet economically. The gamble worked. At a June meeting in Paris, the Soviets rejected a British and French proposal for an economically integrated Europe, joint economic planning, and a requirement to purchase mostly American goods. The Soviets and the Eastern Europeans left the conference, and over the next 10 months, the Soviet Union took steps to solidify its control over its satellite states. In July of 47, Moscow announced the Molotov Plan, which further incorporated Eastern European economies into the Soviet system. Throughout the region, non-communist elements were expelled from governments, an effort that culminated in the February 1948 Soviet-engineered coup that toppled the Czechoslovakian government. We are faced with exactly the same situation with which Britain and France were faced in 1938 and 39 with Hitler, Truman announced. The Czech coup helped to convince Congress to approve $12.5 billion in Marshall Plan aid to Western Europe. In March of 1948, the US announced that the western zones of Germany were eligible for Marshall Plan aid, would hold elections to select delegates to a constitutional convention, and would adopt a standard currency. The meaning of these actions seemed clear. A West German state was being formed. Faced with the prospect of a pro-Western industrialized and potentially remilitarized Germany, Stalin reacted. On June 24th, the Russians blockaded all land traffic to and from Berlin, which had been divided into British, French, Soviet, and US-controlled zones after the war. Berlin was divided into 4 zones, just like the entirety of Germany was. The idea was that, Berlin's technically in the Soviet zone of rebuilding in Germany, but we can't let the Soviets have this entire city all to themselves. Berlin, and it's an ideological thing as well as maybe an industrial, practical, political thing too. So in order to get to Berlin, you got to go through Soviet territory, right? And that's sort of where the rub is here. So let's see. The Russians have blockaded land traffic to and from Berlin. With West Berlin isolated 120 miles inside the Soviet zone of Germany, the Soviet goal was to force the West either to abandon the creation of West Germany or to face the loss of Berlin. Faced with Soviet hostility, Americans were determined not to back down. Churchill affirmed the West's stand. We want peace, he stated, but we should by now have learned there's no safety in yielding to dictators, whether Nazi or communist. We are very close to war, Truman wrote in his diary. American strategists confronted the dilemma of how to stay in Berlin and supply 2.4 million people without starting a shooting war. Although some recommended fighting across the Soviet zone to the city, Truman chose another option, one that would not violate Soviet-occupied territory or any international agreements. Marshalling a massive effort of men, provisions, and aircraft, British and Americans flew supply planes to 3 Berlin airports a day, day after day, month after month, delivering over a ton of vital supplies daily. To drive home to the Soviets the depth of American resolve, Truman ordered a wing of B-29 bombers, the atomic bombers, to Britain. These planes carried no atomic weapons, but the general impression was that their presence lessened the likelihood of Soviet aggression. The Berlin airlift was a victory for the US in the Cold War and testified to America's resolve to stand firm against the Soviets and to protect Western Europe. In May of 1949, Stalin, finding no gains from the blockade, ended it without explanation and allowed land traffic to cross the Soviet zone into Berlin once more. The crisis swept away most congressional opposition to the Marshall Plan and the creation of West Germany and silenced those who had protested a permanent American military commitment to Western Europe. In June 1949, Congress approved the American entry into the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. Definitely understand NATO, very, very big deal, folks. Listen carefully. Ensuring that American forces would remain in the newly created West Germany. NATO, by the way, is a mutual defense alliance formed in 1949 among most of the nations of Western Europe and North America in an effort to contain communism. The Mutual Defense Assistance Act, passed in 1949, provided $1.5 billion in arms and equipment for NATO member nations. By 1952, 80% of American assistance to Europe was military aid. To facilitate fighting the Cold War, Congress passed the National Security Act in 1947. This does a lot. It creates the Air Force as a separate service and unified command of the military with a new cabinet position, the Department of Defense. To improve coordination between the State Department and the Department of Defense, the National Security Council, or NSC, was also formed to provide policy recommendations to the president. This act, the National Security Act, also established the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, to collect and analyze foreign intelligence information and carry out covert actions supporting national security. By mid-1948, covert operations included efforts to influence Italian elections, a success, and to topple the communist Albanian government, which was a failure. The US presence in Latin America and the Middle East. While the Truman administration's primary foreign policy was concern was Europe, it did not ignore the rest of the world. In Latin America, the administration encouraged private firms to develop the region and in 1947 helped to organize the Rio Pact. The Rio Pact was considered the first Cold War alliance. It joined Latin American nations, Canada and the US, in an agreement to prevent communist inroads in Latin America and to improve political, social, and economic conditions among Latin American nations. It also created the Organization of American States, or the OAS. The pact established the concept of collective security for Latin America and created a regional organization, the OAS, to coordinate common defense, economic, and social concerns. In the Middle East, fear of future oil shortages led the United States to promote the expansion of American petroleum interests in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Iran. At the same time, the US became a powerful supporter of a new Jewish state to be created in Palestine. The area of Palestine had been administered by the British since the end of World War I and had experienced increasing tensions between the indigenous Arab population, the Palestinians, and a growing number of Jews, largely immigrants from Europe. As World War II ended, Britain faced growing pressure to create a new Jewish state in Palestine and to allow at least 100,000 displaced European Jews to migrate there. Considering the Nazi terror against Jews, he believed they should have their own nation, a view strongly supported by a well-organized pro-Jewish lobbying effort across the United States. On May 14, 1948, the UN voted to partition Palestine into Arab and Jewish states. Truman recognized the nation of Israel within 15 minutes. War quickly broke out between Israel and the surrounding Arab nations who refused to recognize the partition. Although outnumbered, the better-equipped Israeli army drove back the invading armies, and in January of 1949, UN mediator Ralph Bunche arranged a ceasefire. When the fighting stopped, Israel had added 50% more territory to its emerging nation. No Palestinian state was created, and more than 700,000 Arabs left Israeli-controlled territory, many living as refugees in the Gaza Strip, Lebanon, Jordan, and Egypt. Bitter at the loss of what they regarded as their homeland, the majority of Palestinians and other Arabs were determined to destroy the Jewish state. The Cold War in Asia. Considering the three questions, how did the Truman administration's response to communist expansion in China differ from its response regarding Europe? What events contributed to NSC 68 and how did it represent a change in strategy? That's going to be a really important top secret document. And what were the Truman administration's goals in Korea and how did they change as the war progressed? How did the hot war in Korea affect American foreign policy? If Americans were pleased with events in Latin America and the Middle East, Asia provided several disappointments. Under American occupation, Japan's government was reshaped into a democratic system and placed safely within the American orbit, but diplomatic setbacks occurred in China and Korea. The Chinese Civil War. During World War II, the Nationalist Chinese government of Jiang Jiechi, also known as Chiang Kai-shek, and the Chinese communists under Mao Zedong, also known as Mao Zedong, had collaborated to fight the Japanese. Prior to World War II, the nationalists and the communists were at war with each other. There's a civil war going on, but after the Japanese invasion, they basically call up their own civil war to unite and defeat the Japanese. And after World War II, what do you think they do? They go right back to fighting their own civil war. So let's see. When the war ended, old animosities quickly resurfaced and civil war followed in February of 1946. American supporters of Jiang, led by the China lobby, recommended that the US increase its economic and military support for the nationalist government, arguing that Soviet power threatened China and the rest of Asia as much as it did Europe. Truman and Marshall dreaded communist success in China, but they questioned whether the corrupt and inefficient nationalist government could ever effectively rule the vast country. While willing to continue some political, economic, and military support, neither wanted to commit American resources to an Asian war, which would be like throwing money down a rat hole, Truman told his cabinet. Jiang's overmatched nationalist forces soon disintegrated, and in December of 1949, the nationalist government fled to the island of Taiwan. Conservative Democrats and Republicans labeled the rout of Jiang a humiliating American defeat and tarred the Truman administration as soft on communism. Truman is accused of losing China at this point. To quiet critics and to protect Jiang, Truman refused to recognize the People's Republic of China on the mainland, where the communists led by Mao Zedong had won and remained, and Truman ordered the US 7th Fleet to the waters near Taiwan. Adding to dismay over China, in late August 1949, the Soviets detonated their own atomic bomb, shattering the American nuclear monopoly. A joint Pentagon State Department committee concluded that the Soviets, driven by a new fanatic faith whose objective was to dominate the world, might be able to launch a nuclear attack on the US as early as 1954. The committee's report, NSC Memorandum number 68, called for global containment and a massive buildup of American military force, amounting to military spending of nearly $50 billion for the next fiscal year, an increase of almost 400%. NSC 68 is really going to set us on this path towards the arms race, toward nuclear deterrence, mutually assured destruction, all this stuff. Truman, worried that such a mobilization of industry would choke off the manufacture of domestic consumer goods, eventually agreed to a moderate $12.3 billion military budget for 1950 that included building the hydrogen bomb. Proponents of NSC 68 won the final argument on June 25, 1950, when North Korean troops stormed across the 38th parallel. It seems like all their nightmares are coming true, and like they were right to warn about the expansion of communism. Halting communist aggression in Korea. When World War II ended, Soviet forces occupied Korea north of the 38th parallel, and American forces remained south of it. And by mid-1946, two Koreas existed. In the south was an American-supported Republic of Korea led by Syngman Rhee, and in the north, a communist-backed Democratic People's Republic of Korea headed by Kim Il-sung. In 1949, the Soviet and American forces withdrew, leaving behind two hostile regimes. Both claimed to be Korea's rightful government and launched raids across the border, causing more than 100,000 Korean deaths. With approval from the Soviets, on June 25, 1950, Kim Il-sung launched a full-scale invasion of the South. Overwhelmed, South Korean forces rapidly retreated. Concluding that South Korea's survival depended on it, Truman asked the UN Security Council to intervene to protect a member nation. The Security Council complied and condemned North Korea's invasion, called for a ceasefire, and asked member nations to provide assistance to South Korea. That's how we get involved. We never declare war. It's a UN police action. And if you're sitting there thinking, well, I thought that there was, 5 states who could veto any of them, and, the USSR and China are among them. Why are they going along with this? The fact is that neither of them are at the table. They're both boycotting the UN at this point because of American support for nationalist China. So really the two, socialist and communist powers, they're not there to put the brakes on any of this. So it's a UN police action, and it's really led by, America and Britain and France here. American forces led by General Douglas MacArthur, officially under United Nations control, arrived in Korea in July, but they were unable to halt the North Korean advance. By the end of July, North Korean forces occupied most of South Korea. UN forces, including nearly 122,000 Americans and what remained of the South Korean army, held only the southeastern corner of the peninsula known as the Pusan Perimeter. In September, the tide turned as 70,000 American troops landed at Incheon near Seoul, which is further to the north and west, while UN forces advanced north from Pusan. The North Koreans fled back across the 38th parallel. Seoul was liberated on September 27th. The police action had achieved its purpose, the South Korean government survived, and the 38th parallel was again a real border, seeking to liberate North Korea. Now, however, the South Korean leadership, MacArthur, Truman, and most Americans wanted to unify the peninsula under South Korean rule. It's not enough to kick the North out. Now they got to go north and, take it. Bending under American pressure, the UN on October 7th approved a new goal to liberate North Korea from communist rule. In mid-October 1950, UN forces pushed northward toward the Korean-Chinese border at the Yalu River. The Chinese threatened intervention if the invaders approached the border. relying on faulty intelligence estimates that said any intervening Chinese forces would number less than 50,000. American, British, and Korean forces advanced to within a few miles of the Yalu River, at which point nearly 300,000 Chinese soldiers entered the Korean conflict. We poked China, and hundreds of thousands of soldiers came pouring out. Blowing their bugles, the Chinese attacked in waves, taking massive casualties and nearly trapping several American and South Korean units. In the most brutal fighting of the war, UN forces fell back. The US 1st Marine Division was nearly surrounded at the Chosin Reservoir. When asked about the Marines retreating, General O.P. Slam Smith responded, "Gentlemen, we are not retreating. We are merely advancing in another direction." Within 3 weeks, the North Koreans and Chinese had shoved the UN forces back to the 30th parallel. American casualties exceeded 12,000, but the Chinese had lost 3 times as many. Truman now abandoned the goal of a unified pro-Western Korea and sought a negotiated settlement, even if it left 2 Koreas. The decision was not popular. Americans wanted victory. Encouraged by public opinion polls and Truman's Republican critics, General MacArthur publicly objected to the limitations his commander-in-chief had placed on him. Already displeased by MacArthur's arrogance, Truman replaced him with General Matthew Ridgway. What MacArthur did was write a letter to, I think he was a prominent Republican in the House, and complained about Truman's choice. And the fact is, you can't do that. That is insubordination. And Truman's decision to remove MacArthur is deeply unpopular. Looking back, it's probably the right choice, though. He was insubordinate, you know? This decision unleashed a storm of protest. Some called for Truman's impeachment, and Congress opened hearings to investigate the conduct of the war. MacArthur testified that expanding the war could achieve victory, while the administration argued that it might lead to a global nuclear war. In polls, Truman's approval rating plummeted. At the same time, MacArthur's hopes for a presidential candidacy collapsed because most Americans feared his aggressive policies might result in World War III. By the beginning of 1952, the vast majority of Americans were simply tired of the useless conflict, and they just wanted it to end. The Korean front, meanwhile, stabilized along the 30th parallel as 4-power peace talks among the US, South Korea, China, and North Korea began in July of 1951. The negotiations did not go smoothly. While the powers postured and argued about prisoners, ceasefire lines, and a multitude of lesser issues, soldiers fought and died over scraps of territory. When the Eisenhower administration finally concluded a ceasefire in July of 1953, the Korean conflict had cost more than $20 billion and 33,000 American lives, but it had left South Korea intact. The hot war in Korea had far-reaching military and diplomatic results for the US. Increased military spending, the rearming of West Germany and Italy, and a large permanent American presence in Asia and the Pacific. In 1951, the US and Japan agreed that American forces would remain in Japan and on the island of Okinawa. The Australian-New Zealand-US ANZUS Treaty of 1951 promised American military protection to those countries. At the same time, the US increased its military aid and commitments to Nationalist China and French Indochina. The containment policy had expanded formally and financially to cover East Asia and the Pacific. And now to go back real fast and read Deciding on War in Korea, a deeper understanding of history. Within days after North Korea invaded South Korea, President Truman committed American forces to the conflict, calling it a police action to uphold the rule of law. It was a straightforward and simple explanation of a decision that cost millions of dollars and thousands of lives. But the terms simple and straightforward often do not apply to the way national decisions are made, and it's up to historians to examine the records of decision-making processes to better understand the how and why of it. Among the questions asked about the situation in Korea were, what alternatives to entering the conflict were available, and what considerations produced the decision to commit US forces in the way that it was done? The records provide the following answers. Before the invasion, the administration considered South Korea of no strategic value, but within minutes of the attack, Truman chose to help defend South Korea. A central consideration of the first decision was the belief, as the CIA reported, that the Soviet Union was using North Korea to challenge the US and test its resistance to communist expansion. South Korea had suddenly become symbolically significant, but what were the best means to meet the communist challenge? One choice was to immediately commit American military forces to defend South Korea. Truman could do this by executive order, but a declaration of war by Congress would ensure broad political support. The immediate deployment of US troops could defeat North Korean forces, but this option carried the risk of enlarging the conflict from a localized one to a regional or even a global war. Another choice was to denounce the invasion, provide immediate military aid to South Korea, and seek a diplomatic solution. This option reduced the possibility of expanding the conflict, but it would not ensure South Korea's survival and would make the US look weak. Europeans, to say nothing of the Asiatics, are watching to see what the US will do, one official noted, and a weak response would encourage additional Soviet-sponsored acts of aggression. Neither of these choices met the administration's needs, and they received little or no consideration, but the existence of the UN offered a third option. The choice the US government made was to act forcefully and protect its credibility by using the umbrella of the United Nations. Hours after the invasion began, Truman stated that the US should introduce a resolution to the Security Council calling for the UN to defend South Korea, a member state, against outside aggression. By the next evening, the UN agreed to call upon its members to oppose the aggression and restore peace in Korea. Truman also deployed selected American air and naval forces to South Korea on a limited basis. 2 days later, the Security Council approved a second US resolution calling for member states to provide South Korea such assistance as may be necessary to repel the armed attack and to restore international peace and security in the area. Using the UN umbrella, Truman now expanded US naval and air operations and permitted a limited use of ground forces in Korea. 3 days later, June 27th, as North Korean forces continued their advance and there was no sign of further Soviet or Chinese involvement, Truman ordered American ground troops into the conflict, able to tell the public and the world that they were involved in a UN-sponsored police action to uphold the international rule of law. Post-war politics. Considering the two questions, in what ways did Truman attempt to maintain and expand the New Deal? How did the fear of communism strengthen conservative opposition to his programs? And why did Truman win the 1948 election? When Roosevelt died, many wondered if Truman would continue the Roosevelt New Deal approach to domestic policies. Would he work to protect the social and economic gains that labor, women, and minorities had earned during the war? Conservatives and some of Truman's friends predicted that the new president was going to be quite a shock, that the New Deal is as good as dead. But Truman had no intention of extinguishing the New Deal. Truman and liberalism. In September 1945, Truman presented to Congress what one Republican critic called an effort to out-New Deal the New Deal. Truman set forth an ambitious program designed to ease the transition to a peacetime economy and re-energize the New Deal. To prevent inflation and a recession, he wanted Congress to continue wartime economic agencies to help control wages and prices. He also asked that the Fair Employment Practices Commission be renewed, and he recommended an expansion of Social Security, an immediate and substantial increase in the 40 cents an hour minimum wage, the development of additional housing programs, a commitment to full employment, and a national health system. A conservative coalition of Southern Democrats and Republicans embarked on a campaign to persuade the American public of the dangers of Truman's program, which, they argued, involved too much government, threatened private enterprise, and endangered existing class and social relations. The Wall Street Journal labeled Truman's program a move towards socialism. Public sentiment is everything, wrote an officer of Standard Oil. A Truman official sadly agreed. The consuming fear of communism fostered a widespread belief that change was subversive. Congress rejected or severely scaled back nearly all of Truman's proposals. Wartime economic controls and the Fair Employment Practices Commission quickly faded away. Congress spurned any idea of full employment and a national health program. While Congress and Truman disagreed over the domestic agenda, the country experienced economic and social dislocations caused by the conversion to a peacetime economy. Inflation quickly emerged as a principal issue, with prices rising 25% within 18 months after the defeat of Germany. Inflation, cuts in hours, and layoffs cut into many workers' purchasing power, reducing it for some by as much as 30%. The economic changes led to nearly 4.5 million workers staging more than 5,000 strikes. GM placed ads in newspapers stating that the country was at a crossroads and asked, is American business to be based on free competition or become socialized? And this phenomenon, by the way, of an economic little stumble or recession, even perhaps after a war, is not uncommon, right? It happened after World War I, it happens after other conflicts as well. Many thought the nation had reached the crossroads in the spring of 1946 when coal miners and railroad workers went on strike. The earlier strikes had often been successfully ended through negotiating panels created by Truman, with settlements that usually raised workers' wages and allowed companies to raise prices. But the coal and railroad strikes brought a different response. Truman was angry and determined not to let the unions threaten the nation's economy or dictate to the government. He issued orders for the government to take control of the coal mines and railroads, ordering the workers to return. In May, Truman went to Congress to ask for the power to draft strikers and put them back to work. The railroad strike was settled that same day, but labor strife continued in the coal fields for the rest of the year and ended only when the U.S. government took legal action against the United Mine Workers and John L. Lewis. Truman's action cost him the support of many unions and workers, but the strikes also had led Congress and state and local governments to pass legislation designed to weaken unions and to end work stoppages. Right to work laws, which are still a big deal, definitely understand these. Right to work laws banned compulsory union membership, the closed shop, so it banned, requiring someone to join a union to work here. And in some cases provided legal and police protection for workers who were crossing picket lines. In June of 1947, Congress approved the Taft-Hartley Act, which banned the closed shop, prevented industry-wide collective bargaining, and legalized state-sponsored right-to-work laws that hindered union organizing. It also required that union officials sign affidavits that they were not communists. Echoing Truman's actions in the coal strike, the law also empowered the president to use a court injunction to force striking workers back to work for an 80-day cooling off period. Truman vetoed the legislation, knowing that his veto would be overridden by Congress and hoping that it would regain labor's support for his 1948 presidential run. So he stands up for unions, for political reasons. He knows that it's not going to work. He knows that Congress will override his veto, but he's hoping that union members will see his veto and say, hey, I'm going to vote for this guy for president again in 1948. Amid strikes, soaring inflation divisions within Democratic ranks, and widespread dissatisfaction with Truman's leadership, to err as Truman was a common quip, Republicans asked the public, had enough? Voters responded affirmatively in 1946 and 1947, filling both houses of the 80th Congress with more Republicans and anti-New Deal Democrats. Truman refused to retreat and continued to ask Congress to pass many of the same programs that he had offered in 1945. The political battle between the president and Congress reignited. Congress rejected Truman's proposals, Truman vetoed 250 bills, and Congress overrode 12 of Truman's vetoes. Truman's veto of Taft-Hartley was an easy political decision. In contrast, the issue of civil rights was extremely complex and politically dangerous. Democrats were clearly divided. Southern Democrats opposed any mention of civil rights, while African Americans and liberals, including Eleanor Roosevelt, demanded that Truman speak to the issue. A central part of the issue was the racial violence in the South, where 56 African Americans were murdered within a year of the war's end. One of the worst incidents was in Georgia, where 2 African American veterans and their wives were pulled from a car and brutally murdered. A national uproar prompted an investigation by the Justice Department. Nobody was ever accused or convicted of the murders, go figure, but the crime and investigation increased calls for government action. The North, too, was experiencing racial tension and violence, including several race riots in Chicago. Something has to be done here. Confessing that he did not know how bad conditions were for African Americans and that the top dog in the world ought to clean his own house, Truman in December 1946 appointed a presidential committee to examine race relations in the country. The December 1947 report to secure these rights described the racial inequalities in American society and called on the government to take steps to correct the imbalance. Among its recommendations were the establishment of a permanent commission on civil rights, the enactment of anti-lynching laws, and the abolition of the poll tax. The committee had also called for integration of the U.S. Armed Forces and support for integrating housing programs and education. Truman asked Congress in February of 1948 to act on the recommendations, but no civil rights legislation was forthcoming. The 1948 election. Republicans' hopes were high in 1948. They had done well in congressional elections in 1946 and 1947. To take on Truman, they chose New York Governor Thomas E. Dewey. He had lost to Roosevelt in 1944, but he'd earned a respectable 46% of the popular vote, and Truman was not Roosevelt. The Democrats were also mired in bitter infighting over the direction of domestic policy. Many Democratic liberals and minorities wished that Truman had pushed harder to sell his New Deal type programs and civil rights to the public and to Congress. Henry A. Wallace, the former vice president, entered the race as a Progressive Party candidate. At the Democratic National Convention in July of 1948, liberal Democrats forced the inclusion of civil rights recommendations in the party platform. Southern Democrats, opposing any such statement, walked out of the convention. Unwilling to support a Republican, though, they met in Birmingham and organized the States' Rights Democratic Party, better known as the Dixiecrat Party, nominating South Carolina Governor J. Strom Thurmond for president. Days later, Truman ordered desegregation of the armed forces and the federal workforce. The Navy and the Air Force complied, although it took a year to implement the changes. Afterwards, the 7th Marines commander observed, "Never once did any color problem bother us, it just wasn't any problem." But the Army refused until December of 1949, when it finally agreed to integrate, but only gradually. The Korean War, the first war fought by integrated forces, it sped up integration, but it was not until October of 1954 that the last unit was integrated. Despite his caution, Truman had done more in the area of civil rights than any president since Lincoln, a record that ensured African American and liberal support. Confounding the pollsters, Truman defeated Dewey in a triumph for Roosevelt's New Deal coalition. And you can see that photo there on page 680, a very, very famous photo of Truman holding up a newspaper saying, "Dewey defeats Truman," because the Chicago Daily Tribune had printed what they thought would be true before it happened. Very famous photo there. Make sure you do take a look at that. Where were we? All right, Truman defeats Dewey in a triumph for Roosevelt's New Deal coalition. Despite the Dixiecrats, most Southerners did not abandon the Democratic Party. Thurmond carried only 4 Southern states, and Wallace carried none. Democrats also won majorities in Congress, and Truman hoped that in 1949 he would succeed with his domestic program, which he called the Fair Deal. In his inaugural address, Truman asked for increases in Social Security, public housing, and the minimum wage, the repeal of the Taft-Hartley Act, so there's some support for unions there, and the creation of a national health program. He also gave civil rights and federal aid to education a place on the national agenda. Rewarding farmers for their role in his victory, Truman submitted the Brennan Plan, which included federal benefits for small farmers. Congress responded favorably to Truman's new programs. Sorry about that. Congress responded favorably to Truman's programs in areas already well established by the New Deal, a 65-cent minimum hourly wage, funds for low and moderate income housing, and increases in Social Security coverage and payments. Proposals going beyond the scope of the New Deal encountered effective opposition from a coalition of Southern Democrats and Republicans. A national health system and government intervention in education were communistic, said opponents, while civil rights efforts were part of a communist conspiracy to undermine American unity. That's how they painted. Adding their voices to the chorus, agribusiness leaders attacked the Brennan Plan as socialistic and class-oriented. A frustrated and angry Truman complained that he had kissed more SOB so-called Democrats and left-wing Republicans than all the presidents put together to no avail. Cold War politics. Considering the questions, what fears and events heightened society's worries about internal subversion, and how did politicians respond to the public's concerns, and how and why did Joseph McCarthy become so powerful by 1952? Attacks on liberal programs as socialistic or communistic were not new, but the developing Cold War intensified fears that communists and their supporters were undermining American values and stability, leading to a second Red Scare. Some of the growing concerns were valid. The Soviets did have a well-developed espionage system operating in the country. They were spying on us, including within the atomic bomb program. What do they say? You're not paranoid if it's true? Other concerns, though, arose from political opportunism and broad anti-liberalism. Tobacco giant R.J. Reynolds characterized unionism as a step towards socialism in its multi-million-dollar public ad campaign to defeat a CIO effort to organize Southern workers. In Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, a local paper labeled those trying to integrate a public swimming pool commies. Across the country, neighborhoods and communities organized watch groups, which screened books, movies, and public speakers and questioned teachers and public officials seeking to ban or dismiss those considered suspect of being communist. The Red Scare. Responding to increasing accusations, including those of the House Un-American Activities Committee, or HUAC, that his administration tolerated communist subversion, Truman moved to beef up the existing loyalty program by issuing Executive Order 9835 in March of 1946, which established the Federal Employee Loyalty Program. If reasonable grounds existed for believing a federal employee was disloyal in belief or action, the employee could, after a hearing, be fired. Soon, supervisors and workers began to accuse one another of un-American thoughts and activities. It's a little bit of that hysteria, maybe like a Salem witchcraft type hysteria happening here. Between 1947 and 51, the government discharged more than 3,000 federal employees because of their supposed disloyalty. In almost every case, the accused had no right to confront the accusers or to refute the evidence. While the Soviets used American citizens to conduct espionage, few of those forced to leave government service were actually communists. And if you've read The Crucible by Arthur Miller, you're familiar with some of those tensions, right? There's a reason why he publishes this book in 1953, I believe it is. Truman's loyalty program intensified rather than calmed fears, especially when Federal Bureau of Investigation FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover proclaimed there was one American communist for every 1,814 loyal citizens, and Attorney General Tom Clark warned that communists were everywhere, in factories, offices, butcher shops, on street corners, and private businesses, carrying the germs of death for society. Grabbing headlines in 1947, HUAC targeted Hollywood, intent on removing people with liberal leftist viewpoints from the entertainment industry and ensuring that the mass media promoted American capitalism and traditional American values. With much fanfare, HUAC called Hollywood notables to testify about communist influence in the industry. Many of those called used the opportunity to prove their patriotism and to denounce communism. Actor Ronald Reagan, president of the Screen Actors Guild and of course, future president of the US, denounced communist methods that sucked people into carrying out red policy without knowing what they were doing, and testified that the Conference of Studio Unions was full of Reds. Not all witnesses were cooperative. Some, including the Hollywood 10, took the Fifth Amendment and lashed out at the activities of the committee. Remember that the Fifth Amendment provides protections against self-incrimination, so you can't be forced to testify against yourself. Labeled the Fifth Amendment communists, the 10 were jailed for contempt of Congress and blacklisted by the industry. Eric Johnson, president of the Motion Picture Association, announced that Hollywood produced no more films like The Grapes of Wrath, featuring the hardships of poor Americans or the seamy side of American life. Movie makers soon issued a new code, a screen guide for Americans, that demanded don't smear the free enterprise system and don't show that poverty is a virtue. Just before the election of 1948, HUAC zeroed in on spies within the government, bringing forth a number of informants who'd been Soviet agents and were now willing to name others who allegedly had sold out the US. The most sensational revelation came from a repentant ex-communist named Whittaker Chambers. Whittaker Chambers accused Alger Hiss, a New Deal liberal, one-time State Department official and president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, of being a communist. At first, Alger Hiss denied knowing Chambers, but under interrogation by HUAC members, especially Congressman Richard M. Nixon of California, and also a future president, Hiss admitted an acquaintance with Chambers in the 1930s, but denied that he was or had been a communist. When Hiss sued Chambers for libel, Chambers escalated the charges. He stated that Hiss had passed State Department secrets to him in the 1930s, and he produced rolls of microfilm that he said Hiss had delivered to him, supposedly hidden them inside of a pumpkin known as the Pumpkin Papers. Kind of funny there. In a controversial and sensationalized trial in 1949, Hiss was found guilty of perjury, which is the statute of limitations on espionage had expired, and he was sentenced to 5 years in prison. Basically, they found him guilty of lying in court because they couldn't actually charge him with espionage because, too much time had passed. As the nation followed the Hiss case, news of the communist victory in China and the Soviet explosion of an atomic bomb, both those of course happened in 1949, heightened American fears. Many Americans believed that such communist successes could have occurred only with help from American traitors. Congressman Harold Veldie of Illinois proclaimed, "Our government from the White House down has been sympathetic toward the views of communists and fellow travelers, with the result that it has been infiltrated by a network of spies." Congress responded in 1950 by passing, over Truman's veto, the McCarran Internal Security Act, requiring all communists to register with the Attorney General. The following year, the Supreme Court upheld the Smith Act, passed in June of 1940, ruling that membership in the Communist Party was equivalent to conspiring to overthrow the American government and that no specific act of treason was necessary for conviction. So just believing in communism is enough to break this law. I'm going to skip back over real fast to page 681, Toward a More Perfect Union, the Cold War and Freedom of Speech. Passed in 1940, the Alien Registration Act, or the Smith Act, made it illegal for a person or organization to advocate the overthrow of the US government. It made advocacy of ideas a crime and departed from the view that words and deeds needed to constitute a real danger. Sparingly used during World War II, in 1949, the Smith Act justified the arrest of 12 leaders of the Communist Party whose words and ideology advocated the overthrow of the US. 11 stood trial together and were found guilty. They appealed on the grounds that advocacy of an idea constituted no real and present danger and that their arrest violated their First Amendment right to free speech. Their appeal, Dennis v. US, reached the Supreme Court, which upheld their conviction. Some 140 American Communist Party members were indicted under the Smith Act until the Supreme Court, in Yates v. US, 1956, and Noto v. United States, 1961, weakened the law by requiring evidence that a real threat existed. In 1969, the court concluded in Brandenburg v. Ohio that advocacy of ideas was protected by the First Amendment, but did so without invalidating the Smith Act. Back to the text. Such outcomes seemed vindicated in February of 1950 when Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were accused of being part of a Soviet atomic spy ring. At trial in 1951, the prosecution alleged that the information the Rosenbergs passed to the Soviets was largely responsible for the successful creation of an atomic bomb. The Rosenbergs professed innocence, but they were convicted of espionage. Soviet documents released in the 1990s, the Venona Papers, indicate that Julius Rosenberg was engaged in espionage, but that Ethel, his wife, was probably guilty only of being loyal to him. Documents concerning Hiss are inconclusive, continuing a spirited debate about his guilt or innocence. The fact that we're finding some real spies seems to confirm our fears that spies are everywhere. Like, to go back to the Salem analogy, can you imagine what would have happened in Salem if during one of these trials where they got spectral evidence and all that other stuff, what if one of the accused hopped on a broomstick and flew out of the courtroom? Can you imagine what Salem would have done? It would have exploded. And now here we are in the second Red Scare. The first is after World War I, the second is after World War II. Here we are in the second Red Scare, and we're actually finding some spies. That definitely contributes, I think, to this atmosphere of paranoia. Speaking of paranoia, Joseph McCarthy and the politics of loyalty. Feeding on the furor over the enemy within, Republican Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin emerged at the forefront of the anti-communist movement. To attract votes when he ran for the Senate in 1946, he invented a glorious war record for himself that included the nickname Tail Gunner Joe and several wounds. Note again, he invents this for himself. In February of 1950, he announced to a Republican women's group in Wheeling, West Virginia, that he knew of 205 communists working in the State Department. How specific? When examined by a Senate committee, McCarthy's accusations were shown to be at best inaccurate, but he ignored the findings and continued to claim he was exposing communists. The fears generated by the Korean War increased the senator's popularity and power. Few dared to oppose him, and he found many supporters, including the Senate's most powerful Republican, Robert Taft of Ohio, who slapped McCarthy on the back saying, "Keep it up, Joe." By 1952, with the Korean conflict stalemated, Truman's popularity was almost non-existent, and Republicans were having a field day attacking cowardly containment, calling for victory in Korea, and labeling New Deal and administration programs socialistic. Republicans were sure voters would elect a Republican president. Homecoming and social adjustments. Considering the questions, how did suburban America reflect the social and economic expectations of many Americans, and what adjustments did women and minorities have to make in post-war America? With World War II over, Americans were eager to return home and resume normal lives. Organized Bring Daddy Back clubs flooded Washington with letters demanding a speedy return of husbands and fathers. By November 1945, 1.25 million American GIs were returning home each month. For Americans entering the post-war world, the homecoming was buoyed with expectations and fraught with anxieties. The nation had experienced dramatic economic growth, but remembering the Depression, Americans wondered if the post-war economy would remain strong. Still, most were optimistic that any recession would be short-lived and that they'd be able to spend savings, find jobs, and enjoy the American dream. Consumption is the frontier of the future, chirped one economic forecast. Rising expectations. Owning a home was for many the symbol of the American dream. Before 1945, only about 40% of Americans owned homes, and the housing industry had focused on building custom homes or multifamily dwellings like apartment homes, or maybe duplexes. But the post-war demand for single-family homes, together with the GI Bill, which provided thousands of veterans with low-interest home loans, changed the housing industry. To meet this new demand for houses, William Levitt and other developers supplied mass-produced, prefabricated houses, the suburban tract homes. Using building techniques developed during the war, timber from his forests, and non-union workers, Levitt boasted that he could construct an affordable house on an existing concrete slab in 16 minutes. Standardized with few frills, the two-story house had 4.5 rooms. Built on generous 60 by 100-foot lots, complete with a tree or two, Levitt homes cost slightly less than $8,000, giving Levitt a $1,000 profit. The first Levittown sprang up in Hempstead, Long Island, and was a planned community with more than 17,000 homes, 7 village greens, 14 playgrounds, and 9 swimming pools. Hundreds of lookalike suburban neighborhoods were soon built across the nation, contributing to a growing migration from rural and urban America to the suburbs. Nowhere were tract homes more prominent than in Southern California. During and after the war, networks of roads extended out from Southern Californian cities, developing satellite economic centers, pulling businesses, homes, and industries away from the central cities. In Los Angeles, this resulted in a 50% loss in sales and tax revenues, the reduction of public transportation, the loss of jobs, and a growing urban poverty rate. This pattern of development became increasingly common across the country as suburbs multiplied. Although part of the American dream, suburbs were not for everybody. Widespread discrimination kept some out by design. Whether it was through the official policy of developers like Levitt, individual neighborhood covenants, or denial of home loans, almost every suburb in the nation was predominantly white and Christian. Even though the Supreme Court had ruled in Shelley V Kramer in 1948 that restrictions were illegal, the decision failed to have much effect. To go back and define Shelley v. Kramer real fast, it is a Supreme Court ruling, of course, that barred lower courts from enforcing restrictive agreements that prevented minorities from living in certain neighborhoods, but it had little impact on actual practices and how people were actually able or unable to get jobs. Neither did the court's decision to prevent banks and the FHA from rejecting home loan applications from minorities trying to buy houses in white neighborhoods. Real estate agents continued to abide by the Realtor's Code of Ethics, which called it unethical to permit the infiltration of inharmonious elements into a neighborhood. Across the nation, fewer than 5% of suburban neighborhoods provided non-whites access to the American dream home. For many veterans, a cozy home was only part of the post-war dream, so too was going to college. Armed with economic support through the GI Bill in September of 1946, nearly 1 million veterans enrolled in college. New Jersey's Rutgers University saw its enrollment climb from 7,000 to 16,000. At Lehigh University in Pennsylvania, 940 veteran students outnumbered the 396 civilians and refused to don the traditional freshman beanie. Schools, responding to the influx of students, not only hired more faculty and built more facilities, but also began to provide special housing, daycare centers, and expanded health clinics for married students. By the time the GI Bill expired in 1956, over 2 million veterans, including 64,000 women, had earned their degrees under its umbrella. Veterans expected jobs too, and most figured that wartime workers would relinquish their jobs and return to traditional roles. At first, jobs were scarce. The cancellation of wartime contracts and the nationwide switch to domestic production resulted in 2.7 million workers being dismissed from their jobs within a month of Japan's surrender. Once we don't need to produce as much for the war effort, people are going to be out of jobs because we simply don't need them to, make as many things. Fortunately for veterans, the GI Bill provided unemployment compensation for a year until a job was found. And within a year, jobs were becoming more and more available as American industries began producing for the domestic market. By 1947, 60 million people were working, 7 million more than at the peak of wartime production. But the workforce had changed, with noticeably fewer women and minorities. It matters today, the GI Bill. Passed in 1944, the GI Bill took effect with the end of the war and provided benefits until 1956. Its benefits included a year's unemployment payments, loans to start businesses and farms, money for education, and inexpensive, no money down loans for homes. About 16 million veterans were eligible, who with their families equaled nearly 1/3 of the population by 1950. It was the nation's largest social welfare program, and nobody called it welfare or socialistic. Those receiving the benefits had earned them by fighting for the nation. Almost half the veterans used the education option to attend college or vocational and training schools or to complete their high school education. They also bought homes. In 1946 and 47, veterans' mortgages represented 40% of all new homes purchased. In storming campuses in suburbia, vets and their families reshaped the middle class and reset the American dream with an emphasis on education, upward mobility, and a home with a yard. And of course, that 2.5 kids and white picket fence. How does the GI Bill era compare with today's opportunities for higher education and upward mobility, and how do the differences affect America's economy and society? And because of its consequences, the GI Bill has been called the silent revolution. What types of products, legislation, or opportunities could be promoted today that could produce similar changes in the country? From industrial worker to homemaker. Last hired, first fired fit the industrial workplace as the war ended. Across the nation, women, African Americans, and Latinos were told they're no longer needed. In the aircraft and shipbuilding industries, companies drastically trimmed their workforces as wartime orders ended, dismissing most of the women and African Americans who had provided much needed labor during the war. Mirroring the rest of the nation, in Seattle and Baltimore, 2/3 of aircraft workers and 1/3 of the shipbuilding workers lost their jobs within a month after Japan's surrender. In the aircraft industry, women had made up 40% of the workforce, but by 1948, they numbered a mere 12%. For most women, the loss of jobs was expected. "We will work as long as they need us," stated a woman employee at Boeing, "and when we're through, we'll go back to our meals and dishes and children." Indeed, most of society assumed that women would want to go back to domesticity. A Fortune poll in the fall of 1945 revealed that 57% of women and 63% of men believed that married women should not work outside the home. Other polls, however, found that a sizable majority of women, especially single women, wanted and needed to keep their jobs. One single woman asked simply, "What are we to do? I need a job badly." For women who did keep working, the post-war workplace became highly gender-oriented again. Those women finding or keeping work took lower-paying female jobs. Rosie the Riveter had become Fran the file clerk as wages declined from about $50 to $35 a week. While some women struggled to find or keep jobs, society stressed a renewed emphasis on femininity, family, and a woman's proper role. Psychiatrists and marriage counselors argued that the men wanted their wives to be feminine and submissive, not fellow workers. Fashion designers such as Christian Dior in his new look lengthened the skirts and accented waists and breasts to emphasize femininity. Marriage was more popular than ever. By 1950, 2/3 of the population was married and having children. Factors contributing to the rush to the altar were fears of male scarcity caused by war losses and a new attitude that viewed marriage as the ideal state for young people. Many women's magazines and marriage experts championed the idea that men should marry around age 20 and women around age 18 or 19. With veterans returning home, society celebrating family, and prosperity increasing, the baby boom began and would last for nearly 20 years. From a depression level of under 19 births per 1,000 women per year, the birth rate rose to more than 25 births per 1,000 women by 1948. And that's where you get the baby boomers, the boomers as they're known, of course. In the wider world, the condition of women. In France, in 1949, Simone de Beauvoir wrote The Second Sex, one of the century's most important works on the condition of women. In it, she asked, "What is a woman?" Her answer was that woman was the other, subordinate to man, who was the absolute. Rejecting that premise, she argued that women needed to live authentic lives rather than necessary lives devoted to reproduction and motherhood. Women should dream the dreams of men and achieve freedom. Writing the work, she discovered something that had been staring you in the face all the time, which somehow you've never noticed. Women lived lacerated in a world made to put them at a disadvantage, she said, where reality offered far more victories to be won, more prizes to be gained, more defeats to be suffered. In 1963, Betty Friedan drew upon the observations of de Beauvoir for her own controversial book, The Feminine Mystique, which is discussed in chapter 26. Not all women accepted the role of contented, submissive wives and homemakers. The war experience had changed relationships. When one veteran informed his wife that she could no longer handle the finances because it was not woman's work, she indignantly reminded him that she had successfully balanced the checkbook for 4 years and that his return had not made her suddenly stupid. Reflecting such tensions and too many hasty wartime marriages, the divorce rate also rose dramatically. 25% of all wartime marriages were ending in divorce in 1946, and by 1950, over 1 million GI marriages had dissolved. As the number of female heads of household rose, so also did the poverty and social stigma attached to single parenthood. Following her divorce, one suburban resident recalled that her neighbors avoided her and made remarks like, "Why don't you get a job instead of taking tax monies?" She also noted that her children were singled out at school because they did not have a father at home. Latinos and African Americans restrained expectations. For Latinos, the warriors had brought many positive changes. Many experienced a higher degree of equality than before, and especially among Mexican Americans, there was more of a sense of being part of the United States, of Americanness. A wounded veteran and resident of El Paso, Texas, Moises Flores, recalled, "I am proud to be an American. Sometimes I even call myself gringo, which I'm not. I'm still Mexican, but I'm an American first." The war also saw in many an increasing unwillingness to return to traditional roles. Antonio Campo, for one, had experienced a segregated life in Houston before the war. After the war, he used the GI Bill to go to college and later ran for political office. When told in response to his activism, "If you don't like it, why don't you go back to Mexico?" he shot back, "I was born here in Texas. I went overseas and put my life on the line so you people can make decisions." He lost the election, but like many other Latinos, drew from the same desire for change that energized the League of United Latin American Citizens, LULAC, and the American GI Forum to attack discrimination throughout the West and the Southwest. The American GI Forum, organized in Texas in early 1948 by Mexican American veterans, worked to secure for Latino veterans the benefits provided by the GI Bill and to develop leadership within the Mexican American population. In California and Texas, LULAC and the American GI Forum successfully used federal courts to correct school systems that segregated Latinos from white children. In Mendez v. Westminster, 1946, and Delgado v. Bastrop School District in 48, federal courts ruled that school systems could not educate Mexican Americans separately from Anglos. Mendez and Delgado, they both mandate, that there has to be desegregated education, basically integration. Despite these rulings, throughout the Southwest and West, Latino students remained in predominantly Mexican schools and classrooms, which perpetuated inferior educational opportunities and contributed to higher dropout rates. African Americans had experiences similar to those of Latinos and also exhibited a heightened degree of resistance to returning to old norms. Even as African Americans lost industrial and other higher paying jobs as the war ended, some positive changes occurred. In the South, African American voter registration increased primarily in the Upper South and in urban areas. In several northern cities, African Americans displayed their growing political voice by electing Black representatives to local and state office, and in 1945, they sent Adam Clayton Powell Jr. to Congress from New York. That same year, Jackie Robinson gained more national recognition when he began playing in the minor leagues. While the post-war period generally saw significant loss of income and status for women, African Americans, and Latinos, their experiences had energized many to pursue their own vision of the American dream, one that included not only improved prosperity, but an unfettered role in society and an unmuzzled voice in politics. And it's no wonder that the activism of the 1950s and 60s followed World War II. Examining a primary source, individual voices. The Sporting News editorializes on African Americans in baseball. The Sporting News, TSN, established in 1886 and called the Bible of Baseball, was for decades the most important source for those seriously interested in the sports. Its editorials and articles shaped and expressed the public's views on sports. The following editorials, separated by 3 years, discuss the integration of baseball. Each reflects the views of both the baseball insider and the generalized public and helps today's readers and historians better understand the attitudes and rationalizations regarding race in American society at the time. August 8, 1942, no good from raising race issue. There is no law against Negroes playing with white teams nor whites with colored clubs, but neither has invited the other. Other sports had their Joe Louis, Jesse Owens, respected and honored by all races, but they competed under different circumstances from those dominating in baseball. The baseball fan is a peculiar creature. It's his inalienable right to criticize and jeer in words that not always are the most gentlemanly. Not even a Ted Williams or a Babe Ruth is immune. It is not difficult to imagine what would happen if a player on a mixed team should throw a beanball, strike out with the bases full, or spike a rival. Clear-minded men of tolerance of both races realize the tragic possibilities and have steered clear of such complications. November 1st, 1945, Montreal puts Negro player on spot. This is 3 years later. In signing Jack Roosevelt Robinson, Branch Rickey touched off a powder keg in the South, unstinted praise in Negro circles, and a Northern conviction that the racial problem in baseball is as far from a satisfactory solution as ever. Robinson was reported to possess baseball abilities which, were he white, would make him eligible for a trial with, let us say, the Brooklyn Dodgers' Class B farm at Newport News if he were 6 years younger. Here then is the picture which confronts the first Negro signed in organized ball. 1, he is thrown into competition with a vast number of younger, more skilled, and more experienced players. 2, he is too old. 3, he is confronted with the sweat and tears of toil, with the social rebuff and the competitive heartaches which are inevitable for a Negro trailblazer in organized baseball. 4, he will be expected to demonstrate skills far beyond those he's reported to possess or be able to develop. Granted that Robinson can take it insofar as points 2, 3, and 4 are concerned, the first factor alone appears likely to beat him down. The Sporting News believes that the attention which the signing of Robinson elicited in the press around the country was out of proportion to the actual vitality of the story, and is convinced that those players who gave out interviews blasting the hiring of a Negro would have done a lot better if they'd refused to comment. It's all right with me just so long as Robinson isn't on our club. The standard reply is unsportsmanlike and above all else, un-American. Summary. People hoped that the end of World War II would usher in a period of international cooperation and peace. This expectation vanished with the start of the Cold War. To protect the country and the world from Soviet expansion, the US implemented a containment policy that was first applied to Western Europe, but eventually included Asia as well. By the end of Truman's presidency, the US viewed its national security in global terms and vowed to use its resources to combat the spread of communist power. And documents like NSC 68 are really going to back that up. At home, Truman sought to expand the New Deal, but found success difficult. While existing New Deal programs like Social Security, farm supports, and a minimum wage were extended, a conservative Congress blocked new programs. Linking liberal ideas and programs with communism, moderates and conservatives, with the House Un-American Activities Committee and Joseph McCarthy leading the way, promoted their own political, social, and economic interests. Most Americans expected to enjoy an expanding post-war economy that would bring increased prosperity and more consumer goods. For many, the vision of the suburbs with its stable family structure and new model car in every garage seemed obtainable. Women were encouraged to return to domestic life and to raise a family. Post-war America saw a rise in marriages and the start of a baby boom, but alongside these trends were an increasing number of divorces and women dissatisfied with their traditional roles. While white families seemed poised to achieve the American dream, African Americans and Latinos found that discrimination undid many of the economic and social gains they'd made during the war. Although forced into lesser jobs and still living in a socially segregated society, many saw changes that they hoped would bring economic and educational improvement as well as full political and civil rights.